we introduced a bill essentially based on the work that was done in Monterey County, because what we have now in California is we have a patchwork. If we're going to prevent an outbreak, if we're going to prevent what's occurred in other states like South Dakota, where an outbreak, a COVID-19 outbreak, essentially shut down a meat processing plant, we have to avoid that here, and we have to avoid it at all costs because it impacts all of us. As I mentioned, it's a food security issue. And so certainly what we're trying to do is try to create an educational component where we're educating workers in English and in Spanish, because there is a language barrier issue where a lot of our farm workers speaking Spanish or only Spanish, but educating them on workplace protections when it comes to safety.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Today we have a special guest, Robert Rivas from the 30th Assembly District joining us today. Robert, how's it going? Welcome to the show.
I appreciate the invitation to join you, and all is well in these turbulent and very challenging times. Certainly very different times here at our state capitol, but it's a pleasure to be here for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Shelter in place happened about March. We all went home. Can you describe, I guess, how sheltering in place was for you and kind of how you were able to work with your constituency, basically not being able to physically see people?
Right. Well, it was extremely challenging, to say the least. So I represent, a beautiful district, a very large district geographically. I'm proud to say that I can. I'm proud that I can say that I grew up in the district I represent. So I grew up in San Diego County, it's a district that includes parts of 4 counties, and so it is extremely large. There's about a dozen cities within the district, and so when I'm here in Sacramento, it's great. I get a park in the basement. I could walk to most of my meetings or have my meetings in my office here at the state capitol. But when I'm at home, I log a tremendous amount of miles because I'm driving from one county to the other, from one city to the other. And so not having the opportunity, in the shelter, when we sheltered in place, not having the opportunity to be out in the community, to visit, various stakeholders, leaders throughout the district and all these different cities, counties, and our communities was very difficult. Because I represent a district where the issues are different for these different counties and these different cities, and so certainly having to operate everything through our technology, through Zoom, through conference calls, was incredibly challenging. And certainly took up a lot more time than people probably realize. And so it was an incredibly stressful time trying to address a lot of the concerns, trying to answer questions, trying to get information from the administration here in Sacramento, working constantly with my colleagues in the legislature, with the leadership, within the assembly. Being on, we had 2 standing conference calls that would last 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours, and so it was a very challenging time. And being at home, very lucky that my wife has always, the last few years has worked from home. Spending more time with my family was, different, but certainly was a good thing because I'm always on the road, but certainly my mother, who takes care of my grandmother, who's close to 90. Who lives less than a mile from where we live in Hollister. I didn't see them for nearly 2 months because we certainly didn't want to put them at risk, and certainly my grandmother at risk, being in the at-risk population to should she have contracted COVID. It was a very challenging time, very difficult, but still utilizing our technology, doing virtual calls regularly with our different cities, our different stakeholders. And so it looks like this is going to be the new normal for quite some time. And but it's something that we've adjusted to. Just this afternoon or at lunchtime, I joined a couple of my colleagues, Dr. Joaquin Arangula and Senator Ana Caballero. We had a virtual town hall around the challenges and the changes coming EDD, as we have a record number of unemployment filings. And so, it's, this is the new normal, but we'll get through this and look forward to, those days when there are, our halls here in the Capitol are crammed, and we have the opportunity to get back home and jump on the road and go from city to all these different the communities, because my job is to be out and to listen and to work with all stakeholders within the district I represent, which is something I enjoy doing.
Yeah, recently we had a member, Cecilia Aguilar Curry, on, and she kind of talked about in the rural areas of her county, there's not broadband access, and kind of seeing how
That's
your
right.
county is probably even more rural than hers,
Hmm.
kind of using this new technology, digital medium, is it as effective where you are, and is access has been a problem, I guess, for your
Right.
constituents in reaching out to you during this crisis.
Right. And so I appreciate Cecilia and her leadership. She's a great colleague. She's a great friend, but her leadership that she's brought around the conversation of broadband access, especially in rural areas. We actually carried a bill around expanding access to broadband in rural areas by focusing it on at our most remote fairgrounds in the state. But if anything, in my first term in the legislature, what I've, learned to understand is certainly this is a state that's very difficult to govern because we're so large, we're so different, and there's no shortage of a crisis in California. And so how these crises, whether it's a housing crisis or utility crisis, now a public health crisis, it impacts every region of the state very differently. And so if it's anything that this public health crisis we're under now, it has really exacerbated some of these greater challenges. I certainly, coming from a region where I have lived my entire life, I've seen a lot of change. It's considered a suburban rural area. But this public health crisis certainly has exacerbated this issue of distance learning because of the connectivity, lack thereof, of access for our rural parts. And that has, that is developing an equity issue amongst education and how students, aren't, on a level playing field when it comes to getting the information and utilizing the technology to get that information to establish a level playing field. And so how that's going to impact, educational outcomes for this year and beyond is a huge concern. But certainly, if it's, anything, every day I walk into this building, certainly it's always felt a bit like it's a very surreal experience, and ever anticipated to have the opportunity to represent my home in the state legislature. But I'm always reminded of where I came from. And so being that voice for a state, a part of the state that lacks essential services, that certainly, needs to be part of the conversation, the larger conversation on how we address housing in this state, how we address broadband access here in the state. If anything, if there's a silver lining to our current public housing crisis, it's the fact that we still have a long way to go to ensure that all people in California have the essential services, have the infrastructure, and have the resources that are offered in other parts of our state. We certainly have to do a better job here in California to ensure that our constituencies in all districts have these resources.
One thing that, was clear to a lot of us when the shelter in place first started, we all rushed to the grocery store, and, the shortages in food, and kind of in your district is where a lot of the food of the world is grown. Can you
That's
kind of,
right.
I guess, talk about how, the farming was impacted by the COVID crisis, and, are things beginning to normalize there?
Hmm.
Is food still being wasted?
Right.
And, I guess, what's being done for farm workers?
Right.
Through this crisis?
Right. And so I appreciate the question, and it's a complex one, and it's a complex one because certainly, coming from a region where, the lifeblood of our economy is an agricultural one, where we're very dependent on a productive and viable agricultural industry, and I myself, I've talked often in my first year in the legislature about where I came from, and as I just mentioned, it's been a very surreal experience. If you would have asked me as a child that, that someday I'd serve in the legislature, I wouldn't have thought it possible, because I grew up in overcrowded housing. I grew up in attractive migrant farm worker housing. I was raised by a family of farm working immigrants. I was raised by my mom, who's a single parent, by my grandparents. And on top of that, I had a terrible speech impediment. It's a disability I've had my entire life. And so having to overcome that. And so, being a public servant was never, ever part of my plan. But, certainly in this region that is so dependent on agriculture, that is, I've known at an early age, as long as I can remember, my grandfather stepping out of, our farm worker housing unit every single morning, and he would walk out into the fields where he would work every day. He was a field worker for over 50 years. And so his work to my family was essential, because here in my office, I have his paycheck hanging on my wall. In the late 80s, that paycheck shows that he was earning $6.33 an hour. And on that wage, he supported our entire family. So his work was essential to our family, but also understanding that he was part of that incredibly important food network that provided food security to not only our family, but to our state and to our country. And so farm workers and the agricultural industry has always been an incredibly important part of the history of the state, of our economy, and of ensuring that we all have fresh produce on our tables. And so certainly how this pandemic has impacted our district has been a concern. It continues to be a concern. There has been a spike in the rate of infections in Monterey County, and they are overwhelmingly in the district I represent, in the city of Salinas, in the Salinas Valley. An overwhelming percentage of all infections in the county of Monterey are coming, from Latino parts of the county, from farm working areas, because of this is an incredibly vulnerable population, where you look at every aspect of their job, traveling to and from work in overcrowded, in these crowded buses. They work in close proximity to one another. They share tools. They maintain the same equipment. It's very difficult for them to social distance on the job. But I commend the County of Monterey. They proactively got together industry, local elected officials, supervisors, Chris Lopez, former assembly member, supervisor Luis Alejo. I commend them for working with them to establish kind of a first set of workplace guidelines and these guidance documents to ensure workers were protected and aware of the challenges that this virus poses, and trying to prevent an outbreak. But at the same time, you have a very vulnerable group of employees and a population of people that go home and they can't social distance. They can't shelter in place because they live in critically overcrowded conditions. And we have all the local data to prove it, as the fight that we had advocating for our priority bill last year, our farm worker housing bill. And it is incredibly unacceptable in a state that is touted as having the 5th largest economy in the world, being the most innovative state. But you have people, especially in the district I live, that live in third world country conditions. It is a humanitarian crisis. You have it is stifling opportunity for future generations. I talk about my experience living in overcrowded conditions, but families, I had it easy when you compare to the living conditions of families and children right now here in 2020. And that needs to change. And as a state, we need to do a better job to ensure that our farm working families and that all people in this state and all parts of the state, rural, urban, that they have access to, dignified housing. Because, I attribute all of the opportunities I've had to that, housing security that myself, my brother, and my family had. And certainly it wasn't, the best, unit, but it gave my family every opportunity to pursue opportunities to go to college and one day serve in the legislature, and certainly, how this virus is impacting that is certainly exacerbating the rate of infection that continues to rise. especially amongst our essential farm working workers, and how it's going to impact their families.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is when you're a farm worker, you are essential. If you don't show up for work, A, you're not going to get paid for that day, and B, there's no next man up, right? To pick
That's
that
right.
work up. So I guess what's being done,
That's
I
right.
guess, to protect these workers in case they do get sick and they have to take 2 weeks off because their job is extremely physically strenuous. And if you
All right.
get COVID, it seems like you're going to be out for 2-3 weeks just recuperating.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what's
All
being
right.
done, I guess, to kind of fill the gap in for these workers.
Sure. And that's a great question. And the issue is obviously the agricultural industry. They continue to face labor challenges and a shortage of labor. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. Obviously, when you have a president such as President Trump and his administration, all of the anti-immigrant rhetoric, it's certainly, you have a very vulnerable population that is living in the shadows. So you have agricultural workers, or you have an agricultural industry that is very dependent on foreign labor. When in the district I represent, there's an estimated over 100,000 farm workers and their families that are able to work, but because of their legal status are unable to work. And so that's something that we've got to look. We've certainly need Congress. We need both the Democrats and Republicans to do a better job and do something about our immigration problems, because all that is tied to our food security. All of that is tied to these labor challenges we face in agriculture, and it directly impacts our local economy, our state economy, and our national economy. But more to your question, I commend the County of Monterey in doing everything they can to provide guidance and to provide this very proactive document to ensure that all agricultural employers within the county were protecting employees in how they were doing their job. And so we introduced a bill essentially based on the work that was done in Monterey County, because there is what we have now in California is we have a patchwork. If we're going to prevent an outbreak, if we're going to prevent what's occurred in other states like South Dakota, where an outbreak, a COVID-19 outbreak, essentially shut down a meat processing plant, we have to avoid that here, and we have to avoid it at all costs, because it impacts all of us. As I mentioned, it's a food security issue. And so certainly what we're trying to do is try to create an educational, component where we're educating workers in English and in Spanish, because there is a language barrier, issue where, a lot of our farm workers speaking in Spanish or only Spanish, but educating them on, workplace protections when it comes to safety, PPE, but then also working with Cal OSHA, working with the administration, working with the industry to create a standard, a set of standards that will apply to, the entire state, to all workers, and to the entire industry, because we shouldn't have a patchwork county by county where some counties and some industry members are doing a very proactive, very good job, and in others it's non-existent. And so certainly, working with them, and eventually our bill just got out of the assembly, certainly needs more work, but I look forward to working with the industry to ensure that we have a workable bill, because at the end of the day, it's about ensuring that our agricultural industry remains viable, productive, and that workers remain healthy, that they're able to report to the job and continue reporting to the job, because of the labor challenges that we face. And as you mentioned, finding a replacement for an ill worker is incredibly challenging. And so then obviously deciphering through all the governor's executive orders and deciphering all of the relief packages passed at the federal level when it comes to providing these benefits for essential workers, whether it be sick leave. That's something that we continue to monitor, that we continue to work with our constituents to ensure that they have all the information, they have all the resources that they need to take all those precautions, and certainly take the time they need to get healthy should they become infected.
I think one thing that was really interesting that you just shared is how you grew up and how your brother grew up, and kind of you guys are, I guess, are living the American dream. You're first generation, immigrant family. You've come here, you've succeeded, you've gone to school, and now we've had this big discussion lately of ACA 5, affirmative
Mhm.
action, kind of undoing Prop 209. Kind of you and your brother were able to go to school, I believe, after Prop 209. So you didn't
Right,
benefit
right,
from
right.
any of these things. But kind of,
No.
can you explain how something like ACA 5 would be beneficial for, I guess, people who were in your situation, kind of looking to go to school and live their dream like you've done.
Sure. And I think that's a great question. And, I did not, I went to school after Prop 209 but you know, I talk about my experience often, about my life experience, about, how I certainly feel extremely fortunate and lucky. I feel like my family in particular, that we, I'm a direct product of this thing called the California dream. My grandfather, who raised my brother and I, he not a day would go by where he would remind us, the importance of hard work, how he would labor in the fields, provide for our family so we didn't have to. How he would always emphasize the importance of creating opportunities for ourselves. No one was going to create them for us, but that was going to be evident through how hard we worked. And so certainly, his advice and encouragement was always an incredibly positive example for myself and for my brother. And so, when I, look back at, growing up in poverty, growing up in farm worker housing, as I mentioned, I didn't know I was poor. I didn't know I was raised by a loving family. And it's because of his sacrifice where I've had these opportunities. But when I look now, as I've mentioned, it was tough back in the 1980s being supported by my grandfather's $6 and 33 cents an hour that here in the late 80s. It was tough back then, but families today face much more difficult circumstances and conditions. And we are in the midst of a historic housing crisis. And in the district I represent, in my backyard in San Bernardino County, in the Salinas Valley, you have families living, they are subletting garages, sheds, rooms. You have 4 or 5 families to a single family home. You have 3 or 4 families sharing a 1-bedroom apartment. And in the rural parts of the Salinas Valley, you have schools where their student homelessness rate is incredible. 1 in 5 students, are classified as homeless. There's an elementary school in the city of Salinas, Sherwood Elementary School, where it was their homeless rate amongst their entire student population was near 40%. It was like 37%. And it's incredibly, unacceptable. And so when you talk about opportunities and how can we expect students that have these, incredible circumstances, unfortunate circumstances outside of the classroom, that they have to go home with, they're homeless, that they live with complete strangers. How is that going to impact their performance in school? And typically, they don't perform very well in school because they have all of these distractions. And I know that because I saw it firsthand. Prior to my time in the state assembly, I was a county supervisor, but I also had 2 other jobs. I worked as an adjunct professor at junior college, and I was what was called a student support manager at one of the largest high schools in California, San Bernardino High School. But it was a comprehensive high school. And so I was essentially a dean of discipline. And so I had to work. I was also in charge of truancy. And so I had to work with these at-risk students. And the students that wouldn't have breakfast, students where they came from farm working families and their parents would leave at 4 a.m. and they were just completely absent from their lives. And so these were students that, were not focused. And so it was impossible to expect them to go to the classroom to succeed if they had so many challenges outside the classroom. And so that's why I think this larger issue of mental health and providing adequate services to students within the school setting, but also ensuring that we have a support system for them outside of the school setting is incredibly important. And that's why something like ACA 5 is very important. Is, we should be striving to do everything we can to create opportunities. And some students certainly, there just isn't a level playing field in this state. And a lot of that is exacerbated by the housing crisis that we have. It's unacceptable that we have the highest rate of poverty in this state, which is driven by housing. And so that's why we've got to do a better job here in the legislature of solving this crisis.
You guys just, I guess, passed a version of your budget, sent it to the governor. It's obviously very different than earlier in this year when, there was a surplus in funding. I guess, how has the budget priority changed, I guess, for your district, and kind of how's the budget changing for your district in the sense of, addressing some of these issues you've brought up, and kind of,
Right.
you were just talking, a lot of people are wearing these masks, invest, don't cut.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, what were you able to salvage for your district to ensure, some of these things you're talking about are addressed?
Right. Well, certainly, this pandemic has, upended life in California, and certainly in our country. This is something that has impacted each and every one of us. Every constituent in our district and every resident of California has been impacted by this crisis. And then, obviously, when you talk about a legislative process that is driven by our budget and the priorities around our budget, that clearly has upended the legislative process here in California and here in our state. And certainly, facing this unprecedented budget gap and this deficit, and trying to, as we voted to balance our budget this past Monday, without knowing our revenue figures, for another month, is challenging. This is going to be an evolving situation when it comes to our budget. We have a legislative budget. You have, a governor who has proposed a different budget, and so those negotiations are ongoing. But certainly, it is our budget situation. This pandemic is certainly changing the priorities that we started with. We had, we assessed our bill package, all the bills that we had introduced this year, and we, tried to amend them and recalibrate the intent of our bills to address how this crisis was impacting our district, and how we can boost recovery for not only our district but for the entire state. And working with my colleagues, and so the last few months since we reconvened, I've been incredibly busy. I had anticipated to only have maybe 2-3 bills, and I ended up having, I think, 8. And worked with stakeholders, worked with some state agencies, because they believed in the policy, and they believed in the bills we'd introduced. So we did everything we could to reduce cost, and we'll continue to work with stakeholders to, one, reduce costs, but ensure that the policy is targeted toward addressing some aspect of this crisis that we're facing. We had introduced a number of bills around, equalizing access to resources in the rural parts of this state. We had a telehealth bill, which we still have a telehealth bill. We have an e-filing rural access to justice bill. We introduced this agricultural workplace and health and safety act, around the conversation we just had, modeled after what the County of Monterey did around workplace guidelines. And there's an educational component to it, and other district priorities that we continue to push and continue to move forward with. But certainly, the success of our legislation is going to be driven by the budget. Once we get those revenue figures in July, understanding the expectations, and trying to, live within the expectations of, the fiscal realities we face, is challenging, but certainly is very necessary, because, we have to do everything we can to preserve vital services for our constituents. And I think the biggest issue with, the proposed budget from the governor was trying to balance a budget on education. The impacts to our schools would be significant. Trying to make it proposed massive cuts to our really fragile social safety network here in California, our healthcare system. And so, you have a legislative budget that attempts to backfill a lot of those proposed cuts. But knowing that the situation is an evolving one, we look forward to working with the governor, working with my colleagues in the legislature to do everything we can to preserve those essential services, those essential programs that our constituents rely on. And then also in relation to the budget, the one request we made, which was a very important one around this issue of housing and critical overcrowded problems, especially within the Latino community, farm working communities, is we had proposed to the administration an expansion of his efforts around Project Roomkey to rapidly rehouse the homeless population.
Right.
We had requested a $25 million increase to expand that program to include the ability to rapidly rehouse farm workers and their families who live in these critically overcrowded the conditions, because certainly we need to do everything we can to prevent an outbreak amongst our agricultural workers.
Yeah, I thought this Project Roomkey was kind of an interesting way to deal with the homelessness crisis. I guess, do you see this as a long-term solution to farm worker housing?
Well, I think it's it's an opportunity. I think Project Roomkey to rapidly rehouse our unsheltered population, if we're able to expand that to farm workers, to provide them temporary housing. Certainly, providing them with temporary housing is critical now, but finding a permanent a solution is what our focus needs to be, and that's why solving this housing crisis, working with local governments, working with all stakeholders to address this crisis is incredibly, incredibly important. And that's why I support Project Roomkey. I think it's a step in the right direction, but it's a temporary one, and we have to acknowledge that it's not going to solve our problem. But I would hope that the legislature, I really appreciate the legislative effort now within the Assembly, especially within the Senate, in trying to address this housing crisis. But certainly trying to address the crisis for all parts of California is challenging, but it's something that needs to be, a priority for our legislature.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything else you want to get out there before we go?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on. Again, these are certainly unprecedented times, but these are, this is why we signed up for the job. As I mentioned, I never anticipated to ever be an elected official, because of where I came from, the challenges I had around a debilitating speech impediment. But, certainly, I've always had an interest in giving back and serving my community, and having this incredible opportunity to serve a place that has given so much to me and to my family. This has been an experience of a lifetime, and look forward to serving the great district back home, the 30th Assembly District, all of our constituents, and the great state of California. And hopefully in this whole, this pandemic and this public health crisis that we're going through, that we'll come out as a stronger state, and we'll certainly make this a better state for all.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to talking to you again. Thank you, Rob.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Thank you. Take care.